everyone. Welcome back to Westfield Dialogues, our series where we talk about complex issues going on in the world right now and get a little bit deeper than the usual social media infographic. My name is Madeleine. I'm a former student and teacher here at Westfield, and I now work in communications here. And with me today are Neil, Nidhi, and Shivesh, Westfield students. Everything we express here does not necessarily represent Westfield as an organization, but it does represent our belief in civil dialogue without fear, without silencing each other, acknowledging our own biases, and working towards, hopefully, ultimately, a more just world. So today our topic is the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm just going to give a little bit of overview before we launch into the bigger discussion. So today, the day of recording, it's Sunday, March 20th, 2022. On February 24th of this year, Russia launched a military invasion of Ukraine. And the conflict between Russia and Ukraine goes back pretty far in various ways, but most recently, prior to this conflict, Russia annexed Crimea, which previously belonged to Ukraine, in 2014. There are so far an estimated 3.3 million people who have fled Ukraine or are currently refugees and asylum seekers. According to US estimates, 3,000 to 10,000 Russian soldiers have been killed and 2,000 to 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers, although the Ukrainian number is slightly outdated. According to Ukraine, up to 3,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. Many countries around the world have placed sanctions on Russia. Ukraine is under martial law, and this is all exacerbated by the fact that Russia is a nuclear state, which we will talk a little bit more about later. So Nidhi, what is Ukraine's perspective right now? What's going on there? What can you tell us?
Well, I think that the real catalyst for the invasion into Ukraine, at least, or like I guess Ukraine starting to try to fight back, was when two separatist regions, which had like Russian leaders and like a slight Russian majority, but mostly just Russian leaders, were actually declared independent by Russia. And these two places were both formally owned by Ukraine. So basically, that made it so that these two places could like receive military support from Russia and possibly attack Ukraine. And I feel like that was what really, I guess, started like the whole snowball effect of what happened, because when Russia invaded Ukraine in like February 24th of this year, what we saw is like a lot of Ukrainian people were just trying to like fight for basically their land. And I think that President Zelensky has played like a really big role in this, because he's chosen to stay and fight rather than like evacuate. And a lot of his speeches and a lot of like his, I guess, rhetoric has helped encourage a lot of people in Ukraine to keep staying and fighting. Although there are a lot of refugees, most of the refugees are women and children, because recently there's also been like a mandate where all men have to stay in Ukraine and they're obligated to fight, and a lot of civilians are being given weapons to, I guess, fight back. But what we are ending up seeing is that a lot of like women and children and older people are trying to flee the country in really large numbers, and people are kind of stuck when they're trying to leave the country. And there's been so many like failed humanitarian exports and a lot of civilian casualties that we've seen throughout, because in Ukraine, Ukrainians see it as like a large humanitarian crisis, as Zelensky said, because a lot of Russian soldiers and I guess the Russian army is sort of like attacking places in Ukraine like kindergarten and like schools, hospitals, and other like really important places like that. So Zelensky has called it like a humanitarian crisis in terms of like how Russia is like handling this entire war. And as I said before, with like the mass civilian casualties, there's been a lot of death, but a lot of the Ukrainian people, especially as Zelensky said, have talked about like their dignity and how they want to like keep that and fight for their land. And they're not willing to make territorial compromises and like give back, because they're trying to fight for their democracy. Ukraine's major perspective throughout all of this, which was another catalyst for the war, was that they want to be closer to the West, they want to be closer to NATO, and they don't want to play a limbo. Just around like an hour ago, Zelensky made a speech talking about why Ukraine should be in NATO, or why like the West and Russia are kind of forcing them to play this limbo in between like a Soviet world versus being closer to the West and closer to NATO. Although Zelensky doesn't currently see Ukraine as being a part of NATO in the near future, and has kind of given up hope on that, he was cited by CNN as saying that like he thinks that if Ukraine was part of NATO, then a lot of this, like a lot of the conflict that we see now wouldn't have happened. So I think that Ukraine is kind of like stuck in between like a former Soviet world, which is what Russia wants, and trying to be a part of the West. And that's a struggle that they still see throughout the war. So although Zelensky has talked about being open to negotiations with Russia, he's not willing to compromise on territory, and he's also not willing to compromise on not being able to join NATO or the West, or not being able to like try to like be their own independent country. The people in Ukraine are really fighting for that independence, which is part of the reason that they've been able to stay so strong throughout. But I think the future still like remains unclear.
Thanks, Nidhi. So an issue of sovereignty, an issue of national dignity, and also sort of a national identity conflict for Ukraine about where do they belong. Neil, what is Russia's perspective here? What is going on for President Putin and for Russia as a whole?
So, well, first off, I'm just going to I'll provide like a little background, just like kind of building off of what Nidhi just said, as the context of the war, right? So Russia obviously is the largest nation in the world, and to its western border is a significantly smaller nation known as Ukraine. So both nations were once part of the Soviet Union, and when the USSR would fall, it'd be divided into 15 republics, two of which were Ukraine and Russia. So Ukraine is a nation that has kind of like, embraced Western principles and like is a much more democratic state and a strong ally of many of the Western world countries, right? And it kind of rejects that more of like a kind of dictatorship type government of Russia, right? And so Ukraine sought admission, as Nidhi kind of touched upon, into the international alliance known as NATO, and which is an alliance consisting of mostly Western nations, right? So Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, kind of runs his entire country with corruption and is more of a dictatorship really than an actual democracy, right? And basically, he was threatened by Ukraine's intentions and its abilities, considering that they were allying with some of Russia's greatest enemies, including the United States and the UK. And so, unlike his own government, Ukraine was just a democracy, and their beliefs weren't good for Russia, leaving, in his opinion, leaving Russia threatened. So if Ukraine were to join NATO, they could also possess nuclear weapons, which, according to Putin, would also pose a threat to Russia. And so that's kind of one of the speculated reasons for this conflict that he instigated. And so another possible reason as to why Putin invaded could also be glory for himself also, and also an attempt to like kind of recreate the USSR to an extent and creating a unified all-powerful Soviet state. And that's very good for his own legacy. But I doubt that his own legacy is the only reason why he sought to invade Ukraine, as Ukraine is also a nation with plentiful resources of oil and other natural resources, which are highly profitable. And Russia needs these resources as much of the nation is just an Arctic tundra. So regardless of its size, the resources are though in some abundance, but not great, And then so Putin also claims that his quote unquote special military operation, insisting on not calling it a war, is for like the good of Ukraine, and he intends to denazify it and demilitarize the nation. But that's most likely just fake news that he was using to justify his war. And so because most of the nation of Ukraine does not embrace Nazism, so overall that's probably just false. And then Putin also fails to acknowledge Ukraine as a nation, suggesting that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. And so in doing so, he kind of destroys the culture and rich history of the Eastern European nation. And Russia intends to capture certain parts of the nation and then annex them to Russia, because a lot of Ukraine has like heavy, like very profitable ports in them. And Russia kind of needs those ports as like, they need what's called like a warm port, which is basically like a port that stays that can be used all year long, not just only in the summer, which is what Russia has, right? And so essentially there's several different theories as to why Russia invaded Ukraine, but a large part of that is like just analyzing the brain of Vladimir Putin himself and just kind of beginning to understand other motives that he had, most likely for those invasions, than those he reveals to the public, because it's most likely that he had other motives, but he fails to reveal most of them to the public. And so personally, I believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just unnecessary and far from a logical conflict. Feel terrible for the great adversity of the people of Ukraine that have the stuff that they have to face in these trying times. And overall, it's something that can be considered one of humanity's darkest moments. So I believe that Vladimir Putin should withdraw from Ukraine immediately and end all of the death and the suffering and the, as Nidhi touched upon, like the attacks on hospitals and like certain schools and things like that. I feel like Vladimir Putin should just back out and stop this unnecessary suffering.
Thanks, Neil. Very, very interesting, especially as I think from our perspective in the US and in Israel, respectively. it is hard to understand like why all this suffering, why all this this tragedy. So it's really helpful to get into the mind a little bit of Putin and into the national identity issue. You touched on the resources and also the legacy, two important things that seem to be at play here. So as all this is going on in Russia and in Ukraine, Shivesh, what has been the reaction of the international community? We keep talking about NATO. What is NATO? What is its role here? Give us a little bit of a window into the international viewpoint here.
Yeah, definitely. So now that we've heard from, the perspective of Ukraine and the interests of Russia, I want to sort of expand our scope outwards to the world. And I'm mainly going to talk about what exactly is NATO that we've been hearing all in the news, and just move on to the reactions and interventions of the international community. So to start off, just some background about NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a political and military alliance that was originally founded in April 1949, post-World War II. And its purpose, as they have said, is to secure peace in Europe, to promote cooperation amongst its members, and to guard their freedom. And at the time, this was to halt Soviet aggression and prevent nationalist militarism in Europe, which, just after World War II, we can see exactly why it was formed. And initially it had 12 countries and members. But coming back to the present, the number of member states has increased to 30. And if I could share my screen, we can see exactly what new member countries have been added. So right here is a map of countries that have been in NATO before 1997 and those who have joined recently since 1997. And we can see a clear pattern here. We see mostly countries that are eastward of the original. For example, you have like Germany, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia. Oh, that's not Germany, that's Poland, my bad. Yeah, you have Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. These countries have joined NATO since 1997, relatively recently. And overall, we see that Ukraine themselves have wanted to join NATO. And the reason why this is bad for Russia, why Russia doesn't want this, they've repeatedly said that they would attack Ukraine, they would take it over if Ukraine were to join NATO. And we see regardless of what has happened, Russia has attacked. And what we can see here is this eastern expansion of NATO is one of Russia's main incentives to take over Ukraine. As Neil had said, Putin wants to reclaim the power of the USSR, sort of build it back up. And also adding on to that, the issue with Russia when you have these Eastern countries joining NATO is you have these Western values sort of propagated into them. And if Ukraine were to join, Russia themselves will feel like the Western world is encroaching upon them. And obviously Putin wants to maintain his hegemony or sort of power over all these other countries. So we see here, that's one of the main issues that we see that have one of the sources of this invasion. But now moving on to the purpose on like what exactly NATO is doing is it's supposed to be a collective defense, an alliance of all the 30 member states. And a collective defense means an attack on one member is an attack on all of them. And this is listed in their Article 5, one of their principles that they have. So just moving on to what is happening currently right now, what is the international community doing? I'm gonna talk about three things here. First of all, we see military aid, with several NATO member states have been sending weapons to Ukraine. Notably, I think the US has been sending the most of them, currently over $550 million worth of military equipment. And just 4 days ago, when Zelensky addressed the US Congress, Biden approved $1 billion worth of weapons to be sent, and as well as the EU sending hundreds of millions. And we see this military aid, like such as tanks and like warfare and guns, for example, to Ukraine to support those military members and people who are fighting for their own country there. And the second main thing that has like sort of targeted Russia are the sanctions. And we've heard a lot of these sanctions, this economic warfare. But in reality, what actually is happening is you have different types of things aiming to sort of hinder Russia's influence over the world or their access to money. And this main thing is the financial sanctions, the most devastating, which are the ones directed toward Russia's central banks. So for example, the SWIFT, or the International Cross-Border Payment System, Russia has been cut off from that, as well as their $630 billion war chest fund being frozen, that is outside their border. And we see because of this, NATO is limiting Russia's access to these resources, the money that they have. And you have these measures targeting Putin and oligarchs to freeze their assets so that they aren't able to fund these measures, and sort of Russia loses resources. And we overall don't see any winner coming from this. And the impact of these sanctions is supposed to, as we can see, the value of the Russian ruble has fallen drastically. And the main purpose is to lose confidence in the financial system of Russia. We can see that people who are living in Russia, they are going to be impacted because you see many people going to ATMs withdrawing money because the central bank can't defend their currency because they don't have their assets. But through these, we see these indirect sort of measures. That brings us to the question, that begs the question, why isn't NATO sending troops directly to confront Russia? And I've been asking this question myself on direct military confrontation, but NATO countries have made it plain that if their troops were to confront Russian forces in Ukraine, what would happen is the scope of this war would broaden from Ukraine and Russia to NATO and Russia, which means this conflict sort of broadens into the world, and all the harms that we see right now are going to be increased in magnitude around all the countries in Europe, North America, and the world in general. And the reason why NATO doesn't want to do this is because an escalation for this bigger NATO-Russia conflict not only impacts the people, but even more, this could easily spiral into a nuclear war use. We see currently, we haven't seen any nuclear weapons used, but we know that what they do have pose a significant harm. Russia has the single largest stockpile of any other country of nuclear weapons, and just even that probability of using a nuclear weapon could cause global destruction. And overall, because of this, we see that direct military confrontation there's a low probability that it's going to happen. Rather, this indirect of supplying weapons to Ukraine and economic sanctions are overall the measure that the international community, what these other countries are using. And coming back to Article 5, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, so the alliance isn't obliged to come to the country's defense. And what's actually happening is troops are being sent to Eastern Europe member states. In the news a couple of days ago, we saw that near Poland, we see there was an attack on one of the military facilities. And now, since it wasn't in Poland, which is a NATO member state, NATO, the Article 5 wasn't engaged, and we didn't have this all-out war. But the West has made it clear that if Russia were to step any foot into one of these 30 member states' territory, they would retaliate with full power. And this sort of acts as a deterrent because no one in this scenario wants to escalate to a nuclear war, but Putin has threatened to make it clear that if Russia is going down, the world is going down with it. So that brings us to what is the solution of this? What can we do? And I want to talk about the best case scenario, which is negotiation. Now, this may seem unlikely as representatives from Russia and Ukraine have met repeatedly and haven't come to a decision. But to stop harm to the civilians, which are the most vulnerable people impacted from this, Zelensky may have to take steps to negotiate and maybe recognize Crimea or say to not join NATO. And overall, this possibility of a ceasefire is the best case scenario because it's the only case when we'd have the least loss of life and we'd have overall de-escalation of the situation. And so Ukraine can actually recover from what has happened to them, these horrible things. Their country has sort of been pushed back 50 years because of this, because of the numerous bombings that happen every single day. As Nidhi was saying, on these schools, on these work buildings, on people's homes, people have been forced to flee. And overall, the international community is in solid support with Ukraine in defending their sovereignty. And what these other countries are doing is sort of providing assistance to Ukraine in order to make it, a better place, in order to give them a chance for them to defend off Russia. And overall, because of this, we see that this war, is being dragged on. When Russia made this miscalculation that it'd be done in a day or two, we see that the people of Ukraine have the heart, are fighting for their country, and that's why we're having this war dragged on for so long. That's what happens.
Thank you so much, Shivesh. So as we're sort of getting closer to the end of this discussion, Neil, maybe Nidhi first, what do you see as a pathway to peace? What do you think Ukraine needs in order to make a deal here?
Honestly, I'm not fully sure, but I know that Zelensky said, again, as I said before, that he's not willing to make territorial compromises. So I think that would include the two separatist regions. I'm not really sure about Crimea, although he has given up hope of getting into NATO and would probably be more willing to give up those rights. I think honestly that that's such an attack on Ukraine's sovereignty, because Ukraine really is trying to work hard to separate themselves from Russia, because culturally and socially over the past years, Ukraine was so important to Russia. Kyiv was a really big part of Russian culture, and what we see is that Russia and Putin still see Ukraine as a part of Russia and see Ukraine as made of Russia. So I think that Ukraine would be less likely to do things in order to gain because they want to be able to keep their sovereignty. They want to be able to keep their independence. And I think that although Zelensky is open to negotiations, I'm not really sure how far they would be able to go, especially considering I guess all of the demands that he has and just the ideal to keep their sovereignty. Another thing that Zelensky did talk about is having a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which honestly I think would help keep peace. But however, that would be very, very difficult to enforce, just because you would have to make sure that no Russian planes or no anything else could go over Ukraine, and that's something that's very hard to actually do. So if Russia was to agree to that, I think that would help keep peace, but I don't see it as a viable option for Ukraine. With Pats going forward, I'm not really sure what's going to happen, but I honestly suspect that this war might drag out way longer than it needs to. Although I think that Putin might be obliged to stop after a certain point, because I think Russian people have all these anti-war protests all over, and they're really frustrated with Putin, because I think part of the reason that Putin did this is to take attention away from himself, since at the time there were a lot of labor protests and stuff, and I think that by shifting the focus to a foreign country, he was not thinking he could take the heat off of himself. But what that actually did is people are now really against war in Russia, and a lot of Russian people don't really want to do this and are going to find out soon that their family members are dead from that war and are not going to be open to it anymore. So although this is a dictatorship, I think that if the anti-war protests become too much, Russia might be obliged to back out. But again, I'm really still unsure about the future.
Thanks, Nidhi. Neil, it's true. There has been a growing anti-war movement in Russia, despite massive propaganda mobilization by the Russian government. What pathway do you see for peace? What do you think is likely in the near future for Russia before we sign off here?
Yeah, so obviously I agree that Russia will probably, considering all these protests that Nate mentioned, as well as the collapsing value of the ruble, Russia will be compelled to end this soon. But I feel not in enough time for Ukraine to not be completely destroyed, and the consequences in Ukraine will take too long. So I feel a compromise that could be viable, but not necessarily is the best option. But maybe a firm statement that Crimea is Russian and will stay as a part of Russia, as just kind of a show of good faith of sorts, right? And the fact that Ukraine will be admitted to NATO, but cannot be permitted to have any nuclear weapons of any sort, right? So they can't pose a threat to Russia in that sense, right? So it's basically Russia. It's kind of trying to take away the things that Russia claims to be threatened by. So I feel that could be a viable solution, but still, that's not necessarily, I would say, the best option, considering that Crimea is a valuable place, and that a valuable place in Ukraine, and should be in Ukraine. But I'd say it's a decent compromise to make in order to save thousands of lives in Ukraine. So
I think that the humanitarian crisis between Russia and Ukraine, I think that's something that is a little positive, at least for me, is that like they were able to put a ceasefire because they realized how many refugees need to get out, and around 200,000 people were able to get out in that like short period of ceasefire. And I think that since civilian casualties are getting so like atrocious, there's so many deaths on both sides. There's so many people who like don't have any resources, who are kind of like stuck in Ukraine and are really like desperately trying to leave. I think that as there are more civilian casualties, I really hope that Russia and Ukraine are able to come to at least some sort of understanding to be able to help make sure that civilians are able to escape like without much trouble.
I find it really difficult on how can you negotiate with someone who has, sent military into your country and like has killed your civilians and sort of pushed back everyone in that country and impacted everyone's lives. You have millions of people fleeing the country for their lives. I think that's like really horrific. But I think that the best we can do is stand in solidarity and support Ukraine through this crisis, this war.
Thank you all so much for sharing these different perspectives and sharing your own opinions about the situation in Ukraine right now. I feel like I learned a lot here, and I hope everyone who's watching takes something away too. We hope you'll join us in the comments. Let us know what you're thinking, what your opinions are. What do you think is the pathway to peace here? Thank you all for joining me, and we'll see you on the next episode of Westfield Dialogues.